5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
If you watch old westerns like Valley of the Lawless, Lawless Frontier, or Law and Lawless, you might get the sense that the Wild West was, I don't know, pretty lawless. Which is true. As the American frontier expanded westward, there were a lot of places where the US government wasn't exactly governing. Being thousands of miles away from the federal government's direct control was full of its own challenges and opportunities. Today, instead of looking west, the frontiersmen of the 21st century are looking up. For the foreseeable future, only the wealthiest nations, corporations, and individuals will have access to space. With hundreds of thousands of miles between them and the law, can we count on the mega-rich to act ethically out on the final frontier? Historians are still debating just how violent life was in those frontier towns like Deadwood and Dodge City. But they agree that those high-noon gunfights, saloon brawls, and bank robberies weren't nearly as common in the Old West as the movies want you to think. Spaghetti westerns aside, it is well documented that the American frontier was still horrifically violent. For decades, the US Army was actively waging a war against Native Americans, fueled in part by the discovery of gold and silver deposits in the West. During this capitalist expansion, US soldiers and state militias carried out massacres of Native American men, women, and children by the thousands. Shortly after, the open-for-business frontier attracted working-class immigrants, capitalists, thieves, and robber barons. Many of the frontier settlements for workers were so-called company towns, planned communities where the corporation owns all the lands, shops, housing, even services like police, fire departments, and hospitals. Miniaturized corporate kingdoms out on the frontier. Private security firms hired by railroads, textile mills, and mining companies worked closely with law enforcement to keep unruly workers in line. Between the Civil War and up until World War I, labor strikes led to violence against the people trying to organize for better wages and safer working conditions. In fact, in 1877, federal troops and local law enforcement responded to a nationwide railroad strike by killing more than 100 workers. This war on labor culminated in 1914, when members of the Colorado State Militia turned their machine guns on a camp for striking coal miners, killing women and children. All this is to say that in the lawless Wild West, when the cavalry showed up, they usually made things worse. Which brings us to space. First off, laws do apply in space, just like they do in other international territories like the high seas and Antarctica. It's not like laws evaporate once they leave the atmosphere. When a ship heads out into international waters, there's a need to maintain order and protect the people involved. Outer space, just like the open sea, is a commons, a shared, dangerous, and vast landscape. Space is full of resources and risks. Being able to access it represents a huge opportunity for wealth. Similar to excursions into international waters, no nation can claim territory in space. Nobody can own it outright. But countries can claim jurisdiction over the people and ships they send up into orbit. Astronauts are under a mix of jurisdictions, including the country where the vessel is registered, the country where they're a citizen, and several international laws and treaties. So far, the majority of people sent into space have been military or government officials, so the issue of individuals breaking the law in space hasn't really come up. But space tourism and the era of private space exploration will undoubtedly change that. Our current arrangement of space law mostly comes from the Outer Space Treaty, which was drafted in the 1960s by the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. It's now signed by all spacefaring nations. The treaty says that space belongs to everybody and that no nation lay claim to territory. It states that space is to be used for peaceful purposes and that you can't put nuclear warheads in orbit, station weapons in space, or establish a military base on the moon. Countries must avoid contaminating the moon, planets, and other celestial bodies, and they must avoid contaminating the Earth with anything they bring back. The treaty also requires countries to oversee private sector activities in space, and it holds nations responsible for what companies do in space. Since then, there have been plenty of treaties with a bunch of rules. In 1968, the Rescue Agreement stated that countries must provide assistance to astronauts in distress. In 1972, at the Space Liability Convention, countries agreed that they are responsible for damages caused by anything launched from their territory. And in 1975, during the Registration Convention, it was decided that countries have to provide details about the orbit of every object they launch into space. The United Nations maintains a registry. It's not only international laws that apply to space. Individual countries have their own laws, regulations, and policies about space. And unlike the Wild West, there are no good hideouts in Earth's orbit. You can keep a spacecraft's mission and its capabilities a secret, but you can't keep the spacecraft itself a secret. Just because it's impossible to sneak into space doesn't mean the people going up there won't get into some trouble. But we don't really have a good way of enforcing the behavior of spacefaring countries. The West was seen as wild because it was hard for authorities to get to the remote region. This lack of official oversight gave way to people taking the law into their own hands. In theory, a country accused of violating a space treaty could be brought before the UN's International Court of Justice. But in reality, that just doesn't happen. Last November, Russia blew up one of its own satellites with a missile. The explosion created a cloud of debris in low Earth orbit. Debris that scientists say put the lives of astronauts aboard the International Space Station in jeopardy. Astronauts on the ISS had to bunker down in escape pods instead of tackling daily tasks. The United States condemned the action as reckless, but that's really as far as it went. No fines, no penalties, just a really stern reprimand. I heard that Putin cried. In other words, if a country wants to put nuclear missile silos on the moon, plant kudzu on Mars, and never pay a cent for damages caused by its horrible space program, there's no legal authority that can easily stop them. And those are the areas where the law is clear. International space law actually says very little about the thing that pushes frontiers forward: exploiting natural resources for profit. They probably weren't thinking about this too much back in the 60s when only a handful of countries could launch a spacecraft. But today, private companies can go into space. And there are several startups who are competing to be the first to extract commercial resources from an asteroid. Is private space mining legal? The Outer Space Treaty doesn't say definitively either way. The United States has long argued that it is, while Russia has argued that it isn't. This uncertainty has kept investors away. People are wary of putting money into an asteroid mining company without knowing if it actually has the right to mine asteroids. That's why Congress tried to help the fledgling industry in 2015 by passing the U.S. Competitive Act, which allows any U.S. citizen to possess, own, transport, use, and sell any resources they extract. Basically, the law says anything you bring back from space is yours. The president of one asteroid mining company actually compared the bill to the famous Homestead Act, which in 1862 offered 160 acres of federal land in the West to anyone that can prove they can cultivate and defend it. Of course, there's a big difference between these two bills. The Homestead Act was open to a huge swath of the population. It created new opportunities for immigrants, African Americans, and women to build wealth. In theory, the U.S. Competitive Act also applies to every U.S. citizen, but in practice, it really only applies to the people that already have their own spaceship. So it's really only about giving rich people the chance to strike it richer. Some critics say that this law violates the Outer Space Treaty because it requires the mining companies to assert their claims in U.S. court, which means the court would have to exercise its sovereign rights over a celestial body. But these concerns haven't stopped other countries from passing similar laws so that their mining companies can remain competitive. So far, Luxembourg, United Arab Emirates, and Japan have each passed similar bills. In other words, it's starting to look like some countries have stopped waiting for the international community to arrive at a consensus on space mining and are now coming up with their own rules. The United States is also trying to encourage the view that space mining is permissible by drawing up its own treaties. In 2020, NASA and the State Department drafted the Artemis Accords, which establish a framework for mining on the moon and other celestial bodies. Unlike the Outer Space Treaty, the Artemis Accords are bilateral treaties that the United States negotiates individually with each country. So far, 13 countries have signed on. For the first 50 years of spaceflight, most nations broadly agreed that space was our common heritage. It belonged to everybody. And it was one of the few places where Americans and Russians could be counted on to set aside their political differences and cooperate on scientific research. But then we caught a whiff of the potentially hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of minerals and other resources in our solar system. Now, like siblings eyeing an inheritance, countries are coming up with new ways to interpret old agreements. Adding to the tension is the rise of military activities in space. Nobody knows what the future looks like, but there is cause of concern. Combining vast wealth and vague property laws is rarely a good idea. And adding professional soldiers to the mix rarely helps, because when the cavalry shows up, they usually make things worse. For more videos like this, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any great content. Also, look out for CuriosityStream on social media. Links are in the description.